Daniel. All right. So welcome everyone to the Science Meets Finance event. I'm very happy with the program of today. So already credits to Fabiola for putting a really nice panel together with Mathilde Crippi from the Environmental Coalition of Standards, Andreas Hoepner from University College Dublin, and Daniel Pole from the Rabobank. We'll dive into the topic of the EU Sustainable Taxonomy. And yeah, it's organized sort of in collaboration with Scientists for Future Twente and Greenwash. You might already have heard about one of these two, but Fabiola will introduce Greenwash in a second. And in short, Scientists for Future is a collaboration of scientists worldwide with local chapters in different regions. And this specific chapter in Twente started only in last December. And it's basically scientists who are worried that change is not going fast enough, and we're trying to get people to meet each other and to organize events to have a little bit more impact on the world around us than just through academic work. I thought, just as a small opener, to remind ourselves why we're actually learning about these kind of things. I think you might have all heard about the heat waves in Canada. So I just shortly wanted to start with this recent reminder of why it's good that anyone either in the panel or attending is deepening their knowledge of what we can do to mitigate this crisis. So first, a very short word on the actual sort of how this meeting came to be. And that is actually a message I saw that Andreas posted on LinkedIn, which struck a chord with me. So basically he says here, I'm a scientist and I want to be loyal to nature. And I think you can read it for yourself, but I think this message, for me at least, it reflected what I hear from a lot of scientists who are active at Scientists for Future, that okay, my loyalty lies with planet Earth and with science, and through my work, which can also be political, but I always try to keep this sort of science in the back of my mind and try to, well, basically point to things that are wrong and keep pointing things out which I think are not true. So this was the direct reason for me to contact Andreas. Then I came in contact with Fabiola, and maybe Fabiola, you can tell us more about the program of today.
Yeah, so a very warm welcome from my side too. Thanks for taking the time today to join tonight, despite the Euro being on and all other Friday night possibilities. I'm Fabiola, a doctoral researcher at University College Dublin, or the Michael Smurfit Business Graduate School more specifically. My research revolves around sustainable finance, and within that usually the E in ESG, so environmental issues besides social and governance. I'm lucky in a sense that my research is very impact-driven and gets me involved in many exciting projects, such as, for example, Greenwash, where I'm research co-lead. Greenwash is a tool directed to the financial service sector to assess and monitor the authenticity of climate-friendly green claims made by companies. And our work at Greenwash directly relates to the EU Green Taxonomy, which aims to create a common language that investors can use when investing in projects or economic activities that have a substantial positive impact on the climate and the environment. So to detect greenwashing, a clear definition of what green actually constitutes is key. So we consider ourselves very fortunate to have a range of team members on the platform on sustainable finance. That's the European Commission's body tasked to recommend on the taxonomy for sustainable activities. Personally, I'm a Sherpa to the platform, and then my teammate Theo is appointed through the NGO Green Agent. And Andreas, who will be speaking later and joining us on the panel today, is appointed in personal capacity. Being involved in the process for this taxonomy allows for fascinating insights, and we hope to share some of those today. Moreover, we are very keen to get your perspective on what has been happening and where you feel we should go. So let me briefly run through our agenda for today. After this brief welcome and introduction, I'll go through some housekeeping and try to get a feeling of who our audience is today. I'll introduce our panel and then hand straight over to Daniel, who will introduce the taxonomy to you. We then open up to the panel with some opening remarks from Mathilde and Andreas and give Daniel the chance to respond to those. All the while the panel is ongoing, please do submit any questions that come to mind to the Q&A box that is below the main screen, and also upvote existing questions to help us prioritize what you would like to talk about. After we conclude the panel, we will straight away pick up those questions you posted to our panel and then continue the discussion until 8 o'clock CET, when we conclude and open up the floor for everyone to unmute and to start an open debate. So yeah, from checking the attendee list earlier, it seems we have quite a diverse audience, which is greatly beneficial to any discussion. I'd love to know more about who we have here today. So before I move on, 2 quick polls. First of all, we would love to know why you're here today. What brought you to us? There should be a poll coming up to you. The second question then that we would like to know is your background. So personally, I'm from academia and I have a finance background, but I know that a lot of people joining today from a different realm. So we would be very curious to know where you came from and why.
We already have someone saying this is just my favorite way to spend a Friday night. So I think that's definitely a wonderful reason to be here.
Very good.
All right, let me end the poll. And of course, the event will also be on YouTube. We also currently have a live stream on YouTube. So those people or those who watch it later are not reflected in the poll yet.
Okay, so we have mostly academics here, mostly non-finance background. I see quite a few students, that's nice. Living human beings, I hope there's no bots, that's fantastic. And actually we have most people that work with the taxonomy themselves. That's very interesting because then we don't need to deep dive into too much on the technicalities, I hope. Yeah. Okay. Then we can move on to the next slide, I guess. Yeah, before I hand over to Daniel to get an introduction, there's a lot of abbreviations and it's very tedious, we know. So very good. Remember all of those, I hope, and maybe don't use too many to make our lives easier.
Yeah, then Daniel already scared us in the chat in advance. So
very much looking forward and handing over to Daniel. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Fabiola, and thanks so much, Eric, for having me. Let me see. Oh, am I now able to share my screen? No, the host disabled participant screen sharing.
Let me fix that. Then I will quickly make you co-host.
Great. Well, just a brief introduction for me. My name is Daniel Polen. I'm a sustainability researcher at Rabo Research, which is the research department for Rabobank. And what I do most of the times now is explaining my colleagues and fellow people within the bank what the taxonomy is. So the presentation I'm giving to you now is a presentation I have given a gazillion times within my bank for multiple reasons. Because yes, screen sharing, great. For multiple reasons, because I think seeing the whole sustainability landscape, this will be the new language that we will talk when it comes to sustainability, where a few years ago it was very one-dimensional. We talk about carbon or climate change mitigation or being circular or doing something about plastics. Now the EU taxonomy creates a language which is more rich, which has its boundaries. And I hope within this, 15 minutes, I can give you a crash course, a 101 in what the EU taxonomy is. To start off, a lot of you probably know this ad that had run in the US. Volkswagen was an ad where they claimed they would have clean diesel, but eventually it wasn't really clean diesel that they were selling. It was really a form of greenwashing what they were doing. And there has been a lot of greenwashing in the past couple of years in minor or bigger scale. And the EU taxonomy is basically a language that wants to tackle the greenwashing, make sure that we can compare things, compare different green things with each other, and make sure we have one green that we talk about. In my former career, I've been an investigative journalist and did a lot of research on greenwashing of companies. And you see a lot of this happening because there's a certain value to being green. And now that we want to make that value solid and make sure that everyone talks the same language, and that we can also answer this question: how do you know if an investment is green? That you can answer it surely and clearly. And that's what the EU taxonomy does. Basically, the EU Green Taxonomy is a classification system. So it's a long list of economic activities. These are the NACE codes that Fabiola, if you reminded, talked about, or was in the abbreviation list. It's a long list of economic codes. I think it's 618 economic activities that are under NACE. And this ranges from livestock production, the production of plastics, energy production, all kinds of things. And what the EU did is make a list where they said, well, these activities can contribute substantially to the environmental objectives that we have under the EU Green Deal. So it's a long list, and it's a very long list, and it's going to be longer and longer on what is green and what is not, or, well, I shouldn't say not, what is green and not, well, we can later discuss that part. It's also an implementation tool to see what part of your revenue or what part of your capital expenditures or operational expenditures are in line with substantially contributing to EU environmental objectives. And that's where it becomes interesting. Large companies will have to apply the EU taxonomy in their non-financial reporting. So large companies with over 250 or 500 employees will report every year on their financial reporting. There's also part that's non-financial, and there they will have to say what part of the activities that they do are in line with the EU taxonomy. And this is also the reason why we think the EU taxonomy will become really big, because if large companies will do it, if banks will do it like us, because we also have to do it, it will slowly trickle down into the whole economic system. And we think that, here is where the taxonomy becomes big and really becomes a new green language. So why do we have the green taxonomy? Well, it's to help us commit to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and climate-related goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's also to support the EU Green Deal. It's really an important pillar. Does it work? Yeah, it's an important pillar under the EU Green Deal. And the EU Green Deal it's a big plan to make the European Union more sustainable. One way to do this is direct public and private investments towards things that contribute to these achieving these EU environmental objectives, and that's the lower left part corner, financing the transition. And EU taxonomy is really an important pillar to finance that transition. So what are the environmental objectives that we are talking about? Basically, there are 6 that are under EU taxonomy. So we have climate change mitigation, adaptation, the protection of ecosystems, circular economy, pollution prevention, and the sustainable use of water. These are the 6 dimensions that the EU taxonomy talks about as for now, but it's in development, so new things are coming. For now, the EU has published the lists of economic activities that can contribute substantially to climate change mitigation and adaptation. For this sake, I will stick to climate change mitigation because climate change adaptation is a little bit different. Climate change mitigation is going towards zero emissions, basically, or net zero emissions, while climate change adaptation doesn't have an ultimate goal. I mean, you cannot be 100% climate adaptive, or a house cannot be 100% climate adaptive, but you can invest in your house to make it hurricane proof or earthquake proof. So here only expenditures of a company would fit within climate change adaptations. But with climate change mitigations, you can really say there are certain activities that can really contribute to reducing the greenhouse gases. And roughly you could identify 3 types of activities. You have low carbon activities, so that they are green in itself. So let's say the production of solar PV or wind energy, you know, they are clearly zero emissions, and they fully contribute to the goal of going to net zero emissions. Then you have transitional activities, and these transitional activities emit a lot of CO2 and have a high potential to go to zero. So right now there are probably certain activities that are not net zero yet, or do not emit, or activities that do still emit greenhouse gases, but eventually it will have to go to zero. So the threshold will be lowered over the course of years and with new technologies coming. And then you have enabling activities, and these are activities that enable either transitional activities going to zero or low carbon activities. So these are activities, managing the electricity grid, or doing research, stuff like that. And now how to use the taxonomy, because like I said, the taxonomy, it's a law or a regulation, there are delegated acts, it's a pack of paper. But if you would want to do it really basic, and as a company, how would you implement it? You have a company, in this case, Aber BV, and as a company, you identify what your economic activities are and what the corresponding revenue is with those economic activities. In this case, it's a weird company, so it extracts salt, it produces insulation material, and it produces wind power. First thing you do is identify, are these economic activities in the EU taxonomy, yes or no? In this case, extraction of salt is not in yet. Production of insulation material is in, and the production of wind power is also in. Then you go to the next step, and this is where you go into the delegated acts and the specific economic activities, because every economic activity has a threshold that shows where you have to contribute to do a substantial contribution. The DNHS or DNSH, do no significant harm criteria, and minimal social safeguards. So the substantial contribution is on one of the 6 environmental objectives. The do no significant harm criteria means, yes, you contribute to one, but you should not do harm to the other ones. And then you have the minimal social safeguards. First step, what you would do is, well, go through this list and see, okay, does my economic activity fulfill? In the case of wind power, they're not really criteria because you're green, so that's nice. In the case of insulation material, there's a certain low thermal conductivity threshold. Well, you have to see if you fulfill that threshold. In this case, this company does not fulfill it, so this activity cannot be considered green, or the revenues part of that activity cannot be considered green. Then you go to the next step, and these are the do no significant harm criteria. And then you will have to see, well, you should not produce a certain amount of noise. You have to do something on circular economy and do something with the waste you produce, but also you have to look into biodiversity, birds and bats. There's a certain threshold, or there was a certain threshold where you you have a maximum of like 1% of a certain bird population that can die due to wind turbines. Well, these are all boxes you have to check. If you check those boxes, then you can go to the 4th step, and that's looking into the minimal social safeguards, meaning you have to fulfill international labor law, OECD guidelines. And if you fulfill that step, then you could say this part of revenue of my company is aligned with EU taxonomy. And this is really the simple version of explaining it. So we have 3 flavors in the end. Either you're out of scope of the taxonomy, or you're in scope, but you're not aligned because you don't fulfill one of the thresholds, or you fulfill all the thresholds and you're fully aligned. And what's interesting, and that's also interesting for us as a bank, is because greenness becomes comparable, and because large companies will have to report on the EU taxonomy, we can see what part of revenue is aligned, but we can also see with the expenditures that certain companies have. Let's say an oil company only has 5%, is only 5% aligned, but 100% of their expenditures go to green activities, aligned activities. Then you can see where they're at now, where they're going in the future, and gives you a clear overview of where companies go, especially if you are an investor. If you have a sustainable fund, a fund can now be only 50% aligned, but because you pick companies for that specific fund that are 100% aligned in their expenditures, you could show a pathway toward 100% for your specific fund. So who needs to comply? And I don't want to dive into the compliance a lot because that's a whole other ball game. But it's good to know that it's the large companies that have to comply. It's banks like Rabobank that have to comply. So we have to show what part of our loan portfolio is aligned with EU taxonomy. EU member states who give out green bonds will have to comply, and also insurance companies and other asset managers. And I just want to show this because it shows how big the impact is, because really the non-financial reporting requirement makes sure that the impact of the EU taxonomy is big, and everyone has to do something with it. But in the end, it's not the case that you have to really show that what part is green, because you can either comply or you explain why you cannot comply. And when it comes to, let's say, green bonds, green loans, it doesn't mean, yes, this is the green that EU wants us all to talk, but there can always be other types of green besides it. But the hope and the goal of the EU is, of course, to make this the dominant language. So I hope within these 50 minutes, in a short time, I gave you a quick insight into what the EU taxonomy is. I can understand that there are a lot of questions probably, so please answer them or ask them, and I will make sure, or Fabiola or others here answer those questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for this overview. Without much further ado, I would like to hand over then to our other panel members who can maybe give a brief introduction on themselves, their role with the taxonomy, because they're both directly involved in it, and their experience so far.
Sure. Should I start?
Sure, ladies first.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation to join the panel. So my name is Mathilde Crépy, and I'm part of the Sustainable Finance Platform alongside you and Andreas. I am representing ECOS, which is an environmental NGO. We work on standardization mostly and on technical policies, so on the nitty-gritty of implementing policies, and so this is why I'm involved in that process. Also involved in drafting the criteria, so really the substantial contribution and the do no significant harm criteria as part of the part of the working group doing that. I hope to be able to say some more about this role and what it entails and the content of the taxonomy later in the discussion.
Hey, and I'm Andreas. I'm a professor for operational risk banking finance at UCD Smurfit Graduate School of Business, and also involved in Greenwash. I was already involved in the technical expert group, the pre-group to the platform that we're in now. In that one, I've built Paris-aligned benchmarks, so actually make sure the investment portfolios can decline 7% year on year to net zero. And now I run the data subgroup of the data and usability stream of the platform, and then thereby involved in taking all the standards and making sure that the vendors can estimate it, and making sure that investors will eventually have data, so that the theory becomes some practice.
Okay, thanks so much. Then maybe to kickstart the panel discussion and the debate, we prepared a little question for you. We were asking, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is politics and 10 is science, where would you currently place the taxonomy? In the news, there were quite some discussions on different things included and excluded in the taxonomy, quite some controversies going on. And originally, the regulation itself states that the taxonomy should be science-based and robust. That's what is on the screen right here. That's a press release from the Euro Commission itself very recently. However, would you think this aspiration is fulfilled, or is there still some room for improvement?
I'll say it's a 2 then.
I would want to say a 1. Okay, 2. Let's do 2.
Well, you can do it at 1.
Okay.
Okay. Would you like to elaborate on why there's a lot of politics?
At the moment, there is so I think we always have to look at it in the wider EU action plan. There is a lot of policies that are 8s or 9s or even 10s, and that work really well. The taxonomy is the kind of the light, the beacon, and so it got most attention. But that also means it got by far most attention from the lobbyists, from all sorts of non-scientific interests, and so it has by far the highest lobbying. And at the moment, I'd give it a 2 on the scale from 0 politics to 10 science. That would be my personal view.
Yeah, and the interesting thing was then when the technical expert group we published the report last year, 9th of March, it was really 9 or 10, it was really clear. There were some things that needed some thinking, but then as soon as, people saw the potential impact that the EU taxonomy could have, then it went from a 10 to a 1 really quickly, because it's basically the EU saying, okay, this is the green light you can dance in. Everyone who dances in the green light is green. So everyone runs to the dance floor right now and wants to be in that green light one way or another. So that's the thing that we see right now. And that's interesting. What I saw, I kind of compared the list as far as it was possible of the technical expert group and what was published the 21st of April, the more final list. And there you see, for instance, hydrogen. I mean, hydrogen was, yes, it was in, but you see the dominance of hydrogen now within EU taxonomy. Well, the whole debate about natural gas, it's out now. It will be in one way or another. Maybe we can discuss it later. Nuclear. Even me on Twitter, I haven't had so many people asking me or trying to pull me on what's happening on nuclear. We should do more on nuclear. What's your stance on nuclear? Yeah, it's pretty insane what happened after the tech report came out. Yeah.
Loving the dance floor metaphor on a Friday night here. Mathilde, what's your take? What's your...
Yeah, well, I find it interesting because the idea, I mean, I wasn't there at the genesis of the taxonomy, but as far as I understand, the taxonomy is really built on EU policies. So typically, we have the 2030 target for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The EU said they want to be carbon neutral by 2050. So we have a clear path. There is the Zero Pollution Action Plan that was adopted last year alongside a biodiversity strategy as well, which, for example, wants to commit 20 billion at least per year to creating more biodiversity-rich areas. There are the circular economy action plans. So everything is really tied in very much with EU policies. But it's very interesting to see how much from that first objective of making sure that you divert capital and you divert investments into activities and into stuff that are aligned with those political objectives. We have come to an extremely politicized debate. Well, actually, we have the framework, we have the big headlines of the objectives. We know what the direction of travel is, and we know where we need to be. So it's very interesting, and at the same time sometimes a little bit disheartening to see that some things are considered make their way into the taxonomy and are considered as green when there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that these activities will, be useful to achieve the political objectives that have been already agreed by, EU leaders, and it's the same EU leaders that are bringing in other activities which are not taxonomy, which are not aligned with these environmental objectives. So to cut a long story short, indeed, I would probably put the figure towards more the 0 rather than the 10, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks, Mathilda. I think there you already went in, maybe you saw into the future, but our second statement was actually exactly on what you're talking about now. So I will skip that one, but that was basically asking, how does this taxonomy fit in the context of existing international treaties and similar agreements regarding weight and impact? But you covered this a bit. Maybe I want to come back to something I think both Andreas and Daniel mentioned, the gas debate. I'm not actually sure if everyone who's attending or who's watching knows about this debate, but it might be interesting to share a little bit more about that debate, because I can imagine that even in such a taxonomy, it's not either 1 or 0. It's not either green or non-green. And I read, I think, one article, maybe shared by one of you, probably shared by one of you, about this gas debate, but maybe you can share a little bit of how it went and maybe how it contributes to you giving such a score, such a low score.
Yes, or yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can start. So first of all, in terms of there's a comment from Gregory in the chat as well. So in terms of the international compatibility, some of the design choices made early on don't necessarily help that. So for instance, organizing it by NACE and thinking sector first rather than KPI first doesn't really make it compatible, because other regions don't use NACE codes. Companies can self-classify them on NACE codes. So NACE washing, similar to greenwashing, is going to be an obvious issue because any company can switch the code. So in essence, taking Daniel's metaphor, to run under the green light, there's various different doors. And if my normal door doesn't work, but the door on the left looks really easy, I might just go to that one. And then I just call myself something else, right? By NACE codes due to self-classification, Ital Gas Holding, which is the holding of the Italian gas company, is actually a financial services company, not a gas company. So, and if you wanted to make it more interoperable between different governments, which for instance, the UN is interested now, the G20, other regions as well, you should have potentially considered, or should still consider, to think more from the KPI perspective. So we have a KPI, CO2 equivalent, greenhouse gas emissions scaled by kilowatt hour in this industry, scaled by something else in that industry. And then in essence, we have that KPI and we need to decline it 7% year on year to actually get to net zero. So taking KPIs, applying them relatively consistently, and then declining them, that would be a quite suitable way to make it more interoperable between different regions that have different sector exposures on that point. Now coming to the actual question on the gas. So to date, we don't know exactly who had the idea to put gas into green. And it's very important to say that being green is very different from complying with EU legislation. So the green taxonomy means that you're the green light. It doesn't mean that you are not generally allowed in the discotheque in terms of a dance floor metaphor. So if you're not in the green taxonomy, you might still be non-brown. Doesn't mean that you're brown. So in that sense, declaring gas green scientifically is very hard to hold. Looking at the scenarios, it will have to phase out and go lower and lower and lower. We certainly do not want to declare green to encourage even more investment in gas. So, but someone, and I believe this would be most likely within the cabinet structure, so not the civil servants in FISMA, but the political advisors of the actual commissioners. Every commissioner has 6 to 10 political advisors. These political advisors are the ones that finally draft the drafts for the commissioners, and they are on relatively short-term contracts, which means if they lose a job, they have to find a job in a lobbyist. So they're much more susceptible by design to a civil servant who got a lifetime contract. And so somewhere there, someone had the idea to bring gas in. And in addition to this, on bioenergy and forestry, the taxonomy is not looking particularly strong. But that said, of course, the general EU legislation, RED 2 and RED 1, aren't looking particularly strong as of 2021. And so that led to 9 of us initially to threaten to suspend our activities. And then Mathilde can explain, I was among the 9, I wasn't among the 5 that then actually suspended the activities. And of course, when we say 5, this is 5 organizations. Behind the 5 are dozens of people supporting in total. And fortunately, at least for now, gas is not in the green taxonomy, which is very much against the will of certain heads of states. So Viktor Orban and 7 other heads of state from Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, Malta, and Cyprus wrote a letter saying gas has to be in straight away. Otherwise, it immediately is like seen as not purely green, which clearly scientifically it isn't. But I should also mention that 7 countries with their environmental and or finance ministers wrote a letter, not the prime ministers, saying that gas should be out. And these countries alphabetically ordered are Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Luxembourg, Ireland, and Spain. Sorry, slight mistake in the alphabetical order there. But so there are 7 countries that spoke out publicly. You might want to engage with your Dutch politicians why the Netherlands haven't taken a view on that. I still don't 100% understand that, but they haven't. Neither has France. And France might be clear because of the nuclear. They have another debate to fight, but from a Dutch perspective, it's not entirely clear. But so at this stage, gas may make it in through the back door if we don't watch out. But many countries are trying to watch out to prevent gas entering the green taxonomy, which would mean that it's genuinely considered sustainable.
Yeah, and maybe adding to that, the reason for those countries that you mentioned that to want to have gas in, because if you look at their energy mix and the way they produce heating, it's through coal. And if they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the cheapest way to do it would be to introduce gas-powered. Introduce natural gas, because that's, from fossil fuel perspective, it's the lowest emitting, or it produces the lowest amount of carbon emissions. So there you have. If you would just look at the energy mix, you would see the debate on the different types, because the nuclear debate, well, you have France, of course. When it comes to biomass, you have Sweden, Finland. And the energy mix, just look at Eurostat and you can see where why there is a debate about the EU taxonomy and what should be in or what should be out. And it will be really interesting in what way or what form natural gas will be put in. On the remark on the Netherlands, I have seen that the Dutch minister, because there has been some shift in the Netherlands with ministers, because we are in between 2 cabinets. And the minister sent a letter to the Dutch parliament saying they are, maybe they didn't said it formally in the EU, but they aren't for gas to be in the EU taxonomy. So they pushed really hard for hydrogen. That's something that they pushed for, but because we want to be the hydrogen country somehow. But gas, not so much. But maybe because we are still very dependent on gas, that they didn't speak out very loud. I don't know. There might be some political reasons, but yeah.
Picking up on your point on hydrogen, what I find really interesting is also that hydrogen is typically a backdoor for gas related investments. And at the moment in the taxonomy, in the already adopted act, hydrogen blended with gas is something that is taxonomy aligned. So the distribution of hydrogen in gas pipeline where it is blended it is taxonomy aligned. So you can see that there is already now a little bit of gas, indirectly, but still a little bit of gas in the taxonomy.
But but maybe this is now a conversation going into detail. But the overall threshold for energy production is still 100 grams CO2, or the CO2 intent, or the energy, no, sorry, CO2 intensity is 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, right? So if you would look at the production of hydrogen, only green hydrogen or blue hydrogen with CCS would align with EU. Or are you talking about the gas distribution network? Yeah.
But sorry, this is maybe a little bit too
yeah, maybe it's something to go back to. Mathilde, you were touching upon the different plans that are out in the market already and all these different initiatives. And we were wondering how this fits in. So I remember the letter that Andreas was involved in that remarked that actually, as it stands, the taxonomy is not aligned with Paris, which clearly poses some issues there. So if someone wants to comment on that, maybe.
So I think mostly it's about criticizing several activities, not necessarily the whole taxonomy. The 100 gram of CO2 per kilowatt hour threshold for electricity and energy production is definitely in line with the projection. Actually, I think it was all based on IPCC trajectories. What we were a little bit sad about as the NGO community was that there was at the beginning the TEG had proposed to the technical expert group had proposed the declining threshold, and this was no longer accepted by the European Commission. And so the declining threshold was even more in line with that trajectory of Paris alignment. So this I think was something we regretted. And then, well, there is the obvious forestry and bioenergy criteria, which basically are pretty much business as usual. So anything that is at the moment complying with EU law pretty much qualifies as sustainable, while there are many reports showing to what extent the bioenergy is actually harmful in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The thing is, at the moment also bioenergy is often considered a carbon neutral energy source, but this is a little bit of an accounting trick. So it takes you about maybe 30 years or so to grow a tree. It will take you maybe one month or so to burn it, and that and basically it means that because the calculation is made out of 100 years and not out of the time that it takes for a tree to be burned compared to the time that it takes for that tree to be grown, it's considered as the same amount of CO2 being emitted than the amount of CO2 being sequestrated during the entire lifetime of the tree being grown. So there is a bit of an issue there also in terms of how we account for greenhouse gas emissions, and particular in the forestry and bioenergy sectors. And then obviously, we would be extremely concerned about the full inclusion of gas, be it because it replaces coal power plant or just like that. For us, it's really the same. The taxonomy is not about where we were and where we are going to, or the transitioning. It's really about what is green and like the state of being green.
And maybe just a question on the natural gas. What I'm thinking is, isn't the EU ETS more a driver for whether a company would invest in gas, yes or no, than the EU taxonomy eventually? Because the EU taxonomy doesn't state a certain price. It just states what's green or not, and then the market says, well, you get a cut in interest rate, or you can get capital easier. So don't you think the EU ETS price maybe has more influence because it's directly, you see, okay, it's 50 bucks right now, or 50 euros, sorry, right now, and you have to calculate with it. And with the EU taxonomy, you can say, yes, it can be green, it can be not green, but it doesn't give you any figures. So it doesn't really matter when you're doing an investment.
The taxonomy is predominantly a public education tool, and it's a dictionary. So the influence of it will really depend on the other legislations grabbing from the taxonomy or not. So to the extent that SFDR grabs from the taxonomy, it makes it influential. The challenge with the taxonomy, and that is why I would say the taxonomy is not Paris aligned, although the 100 gram CO2 equivalent threshold is great, but that's a constant threshold. That threshold has to decline, otherwise in 5 years, we are from green into greenish, in another 5 years, we're into light olive, then we're into olive and so forth. And in fact, the bioenergy case and the Renewable Energy Directive makes that best. When RED 1 came into place, people weren't necessarily unhappy. That was prior even to the Copenhagen conference. So that was at that point seen as progress. But you put something in without declining thresholds, without a clear commitment to improvement. And what are the politicians going to do when they do the next negotiation? Well, they have a benchmark and they make it slightly better. And they do that every 5 years, just for practicalities, because in every particular commission, you're not going to switch it over too often. Some commissions not going to do it, and so forth. So in essence, if we put the taxonomy in without a clear commitment to declining thresholds across all thresholds, and the tech had at least a commitment to declining thresholds, the delegated act on the 100 gram doesn't have anything of that anymore. Then all we're going to see is basically a status quo green that in reality is turning from green to light olive to greenwashing, simply because we have to progress pretty much across all these environmental KPIs, and certainly across climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. You can talk about the timeframes for the other 4 KPIs, but on climate change mitigation adaptation, we know at 30 years. So if we don't, by definition, in the same way that we have it in the benchmarks, have declining thresholds on these KPIs, we actually risk creating something which to date is a mix between a green marketing guide, in occasions blatant greenwashing, and here and there really green KPIs. But over time, because of its static nature, has the same problem that the EU ETS had when it was founded, and the actual supply function wasn't dynamic enough. We're not thinking enough what's going to happen to it. We're not thinking enough how it's going to move. And everyone involved in the political process, or most people at least, would probably admit that once a political process has a benchmark, it's very hard to make radical changes to it, because every lobbyist can say, look, let's stay calm. This is what we did. Let's stay there. So creating a static benchmark is a mistake. From a scientific perspective, absolutely. And so Paris alignment means declining thresholds, not the right value in 2020. Paris alignment means the right value in 2020, 2023, 2025, 2030. The right value in 2020 is just the right value at that point in time. That's not Paris alignment. So, and that's why scientifically I remain to argue that the taxonomy is nowhere near Paris aligned, because it hasn't got declining thresholds across the majority of actual KPIs.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. And I think the danger even is, because that's what I also sense among colleagues, is you see these debate on natural gas or nuclear or whatever, but you also see, if you would go 10 years back and see where we were on the biomass discussion, things were differently and things are evolving. So sometimes what happens in public goes faster than what happens in law. And when the gap between law and public knowledge is too big, then the whole taxonomy can put it in the waste bin, because nobody cares anymore. They just would see it as greenwash. And that's, I think, also the danger, and the danger, the reputational damage that EU Commission could get if they would put something out there that would just not be green enough.
Yes, and what is green is going to be a very moving target, especially in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so we have seen it many times. You put a static legislation in, at the point that you agree the compromise, everybody is reasonably happy. But the fact that it's static means the lobbyists won a major battle on not being declining balances, especially for something like climate change, where we already know that we're not having a repeating history. It is getting out of order. It's an exponentially growing process. And that is why it's so important to make sure that everybody understands the green taxonomy, the way it's structured, it's not Paris aligned. Because at the end of the day, it is the choice of the politicians to grab into the green taxonomy or to grab into other mechanisms. They have other tools available that they can actually borrow from, and they have Paris-aligned tools available in terms of the benchmarks, for instance. And so it just has to be clear that if we want something Paris-aligned, then it has to have declining balances, and ideally, and that's where I wouldn't rate the tech report 10, that's more like a 9. Ideally, these declining thresholds are immediately decided. The tech report said decline every 5 years, but it didn't say how many percent on the 100 grams. So, and ideally, we have a clear Paris alignment that follows declining thresholds. That would be a scientific point. If you look at the IPCC report, it is very clear absolute greenhouse gas emission reductions pretty much year on year between 2020 to 2030. Okay, you can take that relative at 7%, but that's what's really needed.
Yeah.
And if I can add, also the taxonomy is about, obviously it will be used by investors and banks. So it's also about giving predictability. So, if you have these declining thresholds, you know that if you're investing now in something that is, in electricity production that is 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour now, but, in the future, the threshold becomes lower, then you know that on the revenue, the company will not be necessarily taxonomy aligned any longer in the future. And I think this is really, it's a missed opportunity to have removed those declining thresholds from the taxonomy where they were proposed.
Yeah, and maybe adding to that, because that's what I of course see, because I talk a lot with bankers on this. I am on calls with different companies, due diligence calls, and every time we say, well, know that whatever, even if it's a gas power plant that you invest in right now, eventually we have to go to zero. And for those who don't know, a gas power plant, they run it up to 30, 40 years with some revisions. So if you would put your money in now, you have to know that one way or another, it has to be zero at the end. So you have to have options to go to zero. And if you don't have the options, then you need to have a lot of money, because at a certain point in time, you just need to shut your plant down, because otherwise it become either too costly because of EU ETS, or maybe legislation will say, Parliament will say, well, we don't do this anymore. So that's really interesting. And on the other side, it's interesting because right now you would see in certain countries, they want to go off of nuclear, and you have to have an alternative because they need base load in their network. So what do? They go for gas. So gas is really in the pinnacle of everything, making a really interesting debate, but also really worrisome sometimes.
Maybe, thanks for the interesting discussion. Maybe we can bring in the last sort of question to you for one last round, and then we can go to a questions from the audience, and then at some point we'll open up the floor and have a conversation. So this last question is maybe I'm definitely not an expert on finance at all, but I think in sustainability and living sustainably, you have sort of different ways you can try to tackle it. So you can try to change your individual behavior. And this taxonomy seems to be to tweak, so to know which sort of parts of the system to tweak to make it sustainable. And then maybe the third level or the higher level is to change the system. And I'm just, it's an open question, but we'd like to reflect shortly on the fact that this taxonomy is a tool for investors. So it's about growth, but growth in sustainable economic activities. But a bit on a system level, could you reflect on growth, so economical growth, and how that is or is not sustainable in itself?
Happy to take that one. So actually, so the taxonomy is really a demand driven, kind of tool. So more like an output based kind of tool, looking at the activities, but not at the supply, at how much of these activities do we need, or typically, on transport, it doesn't look at it doesn't look at more train and less cars. It just looks at how do you manufacture, if you're manufacturing cars, what kind of cars should you be manufacturing? But it doesn't say your production should be limited to 1 or 2 or 3 cars per capita. And I think this is definitely, this system's perspective is definitely something missing. I don't think people are ready for it yet. The same way as I don't think people are ready to have a personal, carbon footprint quota, for that would guide their food choice, their travel choice, their holidays, and so on. So indeed, this is also something that we saw now it's been removed, so agricultural activities have been removed, but for very long you had crop production alongside livestock production, where actually, well, if you think about it, producing plant-based diets are much more effective and environmentally efficient than animal protein-based diets. So this is, for example, something that wasn't addressed at all. Dietary changes, changes in transport system, lower energy consumption. All this is not addressed in the taxonomy, and I don't see this being the top priority for the taxonomy to address. While indeed, I think it would be well a very welcome addition to it, I think.
If I can continue, so there's a couple of issues with the economic growth paradigm. But at the same time, when we all interact, we give each other favors. And so trading favors and granting favors is relatively natural, and that will happen in one or the other way, no matter how you call it. The biggest problem with the paradigm is that we're looking it's not growth in welfare, but it's actually growth in wealth. And so what we need to talk about a lot more is welfare economics, which is our entire welfare. That's the quality of our life. That's a lot of things that are non-monetary, rather than just wealth. And in a couple of decades ago, it went from what originally was welfare economics to just wealth economics. They didn't call it wealth economics because that would have been too obvious. They call it financial economics. But practically speaking, growth is purely measured in monetary value rather than in overall value. By now, we have enough data to easily switch that back. Like in the 60s or 70s, maybe it was difficult. Now data science is everywhere, so we have enough data to actually measure it in welfare. So to have a measurement regime that would incentivize politicians different, that would report on their performance different. But we should really start to think of welfare and then a sustainable growth rate of our welfare, making progress as a society, rather than growth in just wealth. So that's the first issue. And then even if it were just wealth, it is actually done extremely poorly. So GDP is a measure that was developed by Keynes for British war planning against Nazi Germany. And for that, it worked well and that was good. But GDP was developed in 1940. And in 1940 also, pretty much same time, they developed the TV. Of course, at that time, the TV was a tiny box. There were maybe some buttons. It was black and white. There was no Dolby Surround. There was nothing. Very different from the TV of today. And how does the TV look today? You got all sort of innovations over and over and over again. And how often has anyone changed GDP? We're still using that dusty old measure from 1940 that doesn't even have write-offs in them. It doesn't have amortization. Like GDP accounting is actually still pretty much 1940, 1950 style. It's not even as good as corporate financial accounting, and even that has issues from an environment perspective. So looking at the nitty-gritty of what we are actually saying when we say economic growth, then we're basically using a massively oversimplified, say, baseball bat, and then we treat every problem as if you could actually deal with it with a baseball bat. So the measurement there is terrible. First, it's wealth rather than welfare. And then second, even if it were just wealth, it doesn't do write-offs, it doesn't do amortization, it doesn't do the exploitation of natural capital. China once ran a project to actually at least account for the exploitation of natural capital in GDP, and figured out that some provinces then wouldn't have any growth because all they really do is sell off their environmental goods. And that's in essence where we are. So I think to make progress on that debate, which is absolutely possible, it's not a giant debate about systems change, because that simply doesn't get majorities nowadays. It's to look at the actual measures and say, look, guys, we should measure welfare rather than wealth. And even if you just want to measure wealth, most certainly we should look at amortizations, depreciations, and the exploitation of natural resources. Slightly technical, but
yeah. Well, and maybe adding to do what we do as a bank, and I will quickly share this this graph because as Robert research, what we do, it's in Dutch, but I'll translate it. We have a broad welfare indicator. And what we do every year is show the difference between GDP and the broad welfare indicator. And broad welfare indicator looks at, well, what Andreas has said, much more than just GDP. We look at not the emission of greenhouse gases, but the quality of air and the amortizations and the way, or we look at health, or we look at different things other than money. And we do this every year. And here you can see the gap between GDP and broad welfare is growing. So there's something wrong there. And that's what we say, that there's something wrong between what we really need as a society and GDP. And what we see, at least in the Netherlands, is that this concept is being also adopted by political parties as saying, well, we have to shift from GDP maybe to another indicator that better reflects what we need as a society. So I think I think it's going too slow, of course, but luckily politicians are seeing that it's not all just about GDP. We need to have more indicators that show where we should be at. And maybe EU taxonomy can be also incorporated in such a broad welfare indicator, but it should be broad and not just really narrow.
In short words, there is very little we're using from 1940, other than our major economic measure for success,
yeah.
Right? That is just terrible. And the reason why this happens is, once, in public national accounting, there isn't that much money to be made, so accounting firms haven't actually tried to innovate. Second, certain parties benefit from using GDP and they lobby heavily against any change. So for instance, if you were to try to include the exploitation of natural resources, then suddenly the value added of an oil and gas company would be a lot lower. The value added of a mining company would be a lot lower. So all the renewable concept would have been in there much earlier. When Keynes developed it, it had nothing to do with running the country on it. It was just running Britain in the war against Germany on it. Then they kept using it, and no one ever bothered updating it. And so that's where we stand. It is a pretty terrible indicator. As good as it was in 1940, it is basically 81 years outdated, or at least 80 years outdated, give it a couple of years to work. And that's where we are. We're running our economy on an indicator that's at least 70 years outdated. I'll make that statement.
Right. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's that statement. What are we using from 1940 except for our economic indicator? That's one that's sticking, definitely. All right. Thanks a lot. We have some questions in the Q&A, but it's only 2. So I think here I'm going to stop the live stream and let people ask the questions themselves in